In this last portion of the lecture, we're going to change gears and talk about a little bit of physiology. We're going to discuss the concepts around homeostasis and the concepts of feedback. Let's begin with homeostasis. This term, homeostasis, is defined as the tendency toward relatively stable equilibrium between the interdependent body systems as maintained by physiological processes. Now that's a mouthful, but there's a couple of key parts in that definition I want to draw your attention to. First is this idea of relatively stable. When we talk about homeostasis and homeostatic mechanisms, we're talking about maintaining within a range of values. So there's going to be a set point for different physiological variables, but there will also be a range of values around that set point that's considered perfectly normal. For example, we often talk about human body temperature as having a normal set point of 98.6 Fahrenheit. But in fact, there is a range of temperature around that set point that's considered perfectly normal, and that's 97 to 99 degrees Fahrenheit. Blood pressure is another good example. Even though a lot of us think about 120/80 as being a normal blood pressure, there's in fact a range of blood pressure that's considered quite normal, although that range does change periodically as medical advancements are made. So yes, homeostasis keeps the body and the conditions in the body relatively stable, but it's within a range of values, not at a set single value. The other thing to know is that there's some variation involved in homeostasis depending upon the conditions that the body finds itself in. In other words, what's normal when the body is at rest is going to be different from what's normal when the body is very active. In order to understand how the body maintains this state of homeostasis, we need to understand the details of what's called the stimulus-response pathway. I've got the 5 steps of the stimulus-response pathway outlined on this slide. So the very first thing that happens, and it happens all the time to the human body, is that some stimulus is applied to the body at some level. And all I'm talking about when I use the word stimulus is some kind of a physical change or a chemical change in a variable. So again, if you're thinking about body temperature, there can be a stimulus applied to the body that causes a change in body temperature. Think, for example, about a fever. That would be the stimulus that increases body temperature. There has to be a receptor on the body somewhere or in different locations that's capable of detecting the change in the variable. A good example of this are the sensory neurons that are located throughout the human body. Sensory neurons are capable of receiving information from the environment, whether it's information from the outside of the body or information from the inside of the body. There are receptors that can receive this information and send it along to what's called a control center. Now, the most obvious of the control centers is the brain. Control centers are those structures in the body that are capable of receiving input from receptors and interpreting that information. It's the control center that will initiate a change in response to the information it's receiving. And it will affect that change through what's referred to as an effector. So again, we think about the brain as being sort of the king of all the control centers, but the spinal cord is also a control center, and endocrine organs can function as control centers. When I refer to an endocrine organ, I'm referring to a gland that's capable of releasing hormone. The thing to know about control centers that are part of the nervous system, again, the brain and the spinal cord, is that they are capable of responding very rapidly to the information that they receive. In comparison, the endocrine system is slower, but it's capable of causing a sustained response to the information that's coming in. So the control center is going to initiate change through what we call an effector. And all an effector is a structure that will bring that change in order to get the variable back into the normal range. So most of the body structures can function as effectors, including things like the skeletal muscle and exocrine glands that secrete other things besides hormones. What the effector is going to do as it brings the variable back into the normal range is basically initiate a response to that original stimulus. So this stimulus response pathway is going on all the time in the human body in order to maintain homeostasis. I mentioned body temperature as being one of the variables that is controlled through homeostatic mechanisms. Down on the bottom of the slide, you can see the stimulus response pathway laid out from the stimulus over on the left, which is received by the receptor, which sends the information into the control center, which initiates a response through an effector, which creates the response. So if we think about body temperature, remember we said the normal range in a human is approximately 97 to 99 degrees Fahrenheit. So let's imagine that there's a person who is outside doing some heavy exercise on a very hot day. The stimulus then for this particular example is the environmental heat, the hot outdoor temperature. Now I put an asterisk next to environmental temperature because it's important to mention here that body temperature is not just impacted by what's happening around us in the environment, right? There are also things that go on inside the body, in the internal environment, that can affect body temperature. Things, for example, like infections and even just bad inflammatory responses can impact your body temperature. But for this example, let's think about a situation that's going on outside of the body with a high environmental temperature and a person who is trying to exercise vigorously. What will happen is the body temperature, at least on the surface, not necessarily at the core, but at least on the surface of the body, is going to start to increase as this person exercises out in the heat. And you've all felt this at some point or another. Your skin begins to feel warmer to you. It might get red. It might be hot to the touch. What's happening is the external temperature is affecting the peripheral body temperature, and that is a stimulus. The body needs to work to keep the body temperature within the normal range. The body does not want to allow the core temperature in the body to go outside of that normal range, because there can be adverse effects of having a body temperature that is too low or too high. Now, the receptor for an increasing body temperature is actually called a thermoreceptor, and it's located in the skin on the entire surface of the body. It happens to be in both the upper layer, the epidermis of the skin, and also in the layer beneath, the dermis of the skin. The thermoreceptor is going to receive information about the increase in the temperature of the skin that is occurring because of exposure to this high environmental temperature. And the thermoreceptor is going to relay that information using nerves and send it to the control center, which for temperature happens to be a region of the brain called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is a control center, so it's going to receive the input coming in from the receptors, it's going to integrate that information, and it's going to respond. It will send out that response through effectors. And in the case of body temperature, the effectors include blood vessels, sweat glands, and even the skeletal muscle. Those effectors are going to elicit a response which will cause a change in the body temperature back into the normal range. So, when the skin starts to heat up, when the surface or the periphery of the body starts to warm up because the person is exercising out in the heat, the thermoreceptors will detect that. The hypothalamus will then cause the blood vessels that are out in the periphery of the body to dilate. That's going to help release some of the heat of the body. The sweat glands will be stimulated and sweat will be produced over the surface of the skin. The sweat will also help rid the body of heat as it evaporates. Skeletal muscle isn't generally involved in bringing body temperature down, but if we were talking about an example of a person whose body temperature was getting too low, skeletal muscle would come into play. I'm sure you've all experienced the feeling of being outside in the winter and starting to get cold and having uncontrollable shivering of your skeletal muscle. That is an effector response designed to increase your body temperature when it's getting too low. So, with the combination of dilating blood vessels and the release of sweat from the sweat glands, that's going to help eliminate the excessive heat from the peripheral portions of the body, and the response will be that the temperature will drop back down and stay within the normal range. Homeostasis is a critical function in the human body. It helps to keep body system variables within these normal ranges around, again, what we call a set point. Homeostasis is achieved through what is generally referred to as feedback. And there are two kinds of feedback, negative and positive. It turns out that most of the physiological processes in the human body are controlled by negative feedback. Take a look at the drawing at the bottom of this slide. We're looking at a graph that has time passing by on the x-axis and some kind of a variable on the y-axis. This could be temperature, this could be blood pressure, this could be any of the variables inside the human body that fall within a normal range around a set point. So they're showing us in the blue region what the normal range for this particular variable is. and the black line through the center represents that set point. Now notice that as time goes by, the actual number, the actual measurement for the variable is fluctuating. It's going from low up to the set point and then beyond high, and then it comes back down to the set point and drops below it and comes back up. In other words, within the body, the amount of time that a variable stays at its perfect set point is actually pretty small. Most of the time, that variable is fluctuating around its set point. And again, in humans, that fluctuation is controlled primarily through this negative type of feedback. Temperature control, for example, is maintained through negative feedback. Now, what do we mean when we call feedback negative? What we're saying is that the result, remember, at the end of the stimulus response pathway, that response or that result is going to be in the opposite direction to the stimulus. And we're going to see these fluctuations up and down around the set point. So, if it's very hot outside and the person is vigorously exercising and their peripheral temperature starts to rise, negative feedback will kick in, and through the stimulus response pathway, the resulting action will be to lower the body temperature back down into the normal range. Negative feedback. Positive feedback is something very different, and there aren't that many examples of positive feedback inside the human body, but there are a couple. Positive feedback is the kind of feedback where the stimulus is actually reinforced by the feedback mechanism. In other words, the direction that the variable is changing due to the stimulus is going to continue to change in that direction until some kind of a climactic event occurs. And it's actually the climactic event that will send the variable back down into the normal range and to the set point. Now, the sort of classic example of positive feedback in the human body is in the female, and it involves the menstrual cycle. Females, of course, menstruate and have a cycle of about 28 days. In the middle of the cycle, the female will ovulate. And just prior to ovulation, a hormone called estrogen is going to increase in her body. Estrogen is being produced and released from cells in her ovary. Estrogen is under positive feedback. So what that means is that as estrogen levels start to go up in the first half of the menstrual cycle, positive feedback is going to reinforce that increase. In other words, the more estrogen that is secreted, the more will be made. More estrogen secreted, even more will be made. More estrogen secreted, even more will be made, until we reach a climactic event. In the female, that climactic event is a surge of a hormone called LH. Now, that detail is not important for us to know, but it's important to know that what LH does is trigger ovulation. And when ovulation occurs, the estrogen levels immediately drop back down into the normal range. Another really good example of positive feedback is also in the female, and it involves the hormone called oxytocin and the process of childbirth. Take a look at the diagram on the bottom of the slide. It represents this positive feedback cycle during childbirth. In the center of the diagram, we can see a woman's body. Her backbone is right here. Her head would be over here to the left. You can see her leg over here to the right. And of course, the uterus is visible with the infant inside, ready to be delivered. Now, if we think about the stimulus response pathway, the stimulus in this positive feedback cycle involves the baby's head. This head is going to apply pressure down onto the cervix with each contraction. The receptors for pressure are located in the cervix, and they're going to send the information, the pressure information, to the control center, which is the brain. Now, nerve impulses, once they arrive at the brain, are going to result in the brain releasing hormones to stimulate the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland, which is located on the ventral surface of the brain, is going to begin secreting this hormone called oxytocin. What oxytocin will do is stimulate the uterus to contract. The stimulation of contractions in the uterus is going to push the baby's head down into the cervix. And that's going to continue the cycle. Again, in the same direction. More pressure on the cervix, more signals get sent to the brain, more stimulation of the pituitary gland, more oxytocin gets released, more uterine contractions, which cause the head to press down on the cervix, which gets relayed to the brain, which causes the release of oxytocin, which causes more uterine contractions to occur. This is a positive feedback cycle. It will continue in this direction until that climactic event occurs. And of course, the climactic event in childbirth is when the cervix is open wide enough for the baby to be expelled out of the uterus. On this slide, we're looking at a comparison of negative and positive feedback cycles within the reproductive system. On the left-hand side of the slide, you're looking at a negative feedback loop for the production of the hormone called testosterone in the male. On the right-hand side, you're looking at a positive feedback loop for the production of estrogen during the menstrual cycle, as we mentioned a few minutes ago. The key things to remember about the difference between negative and positive feedback is the direction of the response. Remember, during negative feedback, as the variable moves in one direction because of the stimulus, the response is going to move it in the other direction, carrying it back down to the normal range around that set point. In comparison, during positive feedback, as the stimulus moves the variable in one direction, the response is going to reinforce that. It's going to allow it to keep moving in that one direction until a climactic event occurs to stop it. So let's walk through the diagram for negative feedback first. In the male, the hypothalamus secretes hormones that stimulate the pituitary gland, particularly what's called the anterior pituitary gland, to release additional hormones that will stimulate the endocrine gland called the testicle. So in this example, the endocrine gland, the testicle, is going to produce a hormone called testosterone. In the male, testosterone is important for several things, including the production of sperm and the development of what are called secondary sex characteristics. So think, for example, about the increase in skeletal muscle coverage that you see in a male human versus a female. That increase in muscle coverage comes from testosterone. Now, there is a normal range for testosterone in a male, and there's a set point for how much testosterone should be in the blood. As the testosterone level goes up and has its effects on the muscle, that testosterone is going to feed back to both the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary in a negative way. Remember what that means. That means it's going to cause these organs to do the opposite of what they've been doing. So instead of the hypothalamus stimulating the pituitary and the pituitary stimulating the testicle, through negative feedback, we're going to see a reduction in that stimulation. As the testicle is stimulated less and less, it will start to produce less testosterone. As testosterone levels drop, we will have a negative feedback loop. It's going to occur in the opposite direction. Since testosterone levels are dropping, that's going to cause the hypothalamus to stimulate the pituitary and stimulate the testicle and make more testosterone. The higher level of testosterone will then feed back to make less testosterone, and the testosterone levels will go up and down and up and down around the set point, just like we saw in this diagram. Less testosterone will stimulate more testosterone, which will stimulate less, which will stimulate more, and so on, keeping testosterone levels in that normal range. Compare that to what's happening in the female ovary. The hypothalamus, again, is stimulating the anterior pituitary, but this time in the female. The anterior pituitary is releasing hormones that stimulate the ovary this time instead of the testicle, and the ovary is producing estrogens. Those estrogens will feed back, just like testosterone did, but they're going to feed back in a positive way. They're going to reinforce the stimulus. So the hypothalamus will keep stimulating the pituitary, which will keep stimulating the ovary, which will make more and more estrogen. And it will keep going, more estrogen, more estrogen, more estrogen, until the climactic event occurs, which is ovulation. So again, remember that in human beings, homeostasis requires feedback mechanisms. And when it comes to the human, most of the feedback that we see going on is the negative variety. But there are those couple of good examples in females of the positive feedback loop.